What's crack, guys? Your boy Daniel here from Stack Strength, and today I'm going to be talking all about how to train your legs for strength and size. Now, there are two primary objectives of this video. The first is to cover the science, the research, and so you can understand the fundamentals of how to build muscle and strength really effectively. And the second piece, which is also an incredibly critical component, is to understand how it's actually going to be applied in real-world scenarios. It's very, very important to understand the fundamentals. It's important to understand the mechanisms and all of that stuff. But if you can't apply it to your specific situation, it's really fucking useless. So that's why in this video, I'm going to give you specific recommendations. We're going to talk about practical steps for exercise sequencing, exercise selection, and at the end, I'm even going to give you two sample workouts for your lower body days to really build your legs for strength and size. Now, the objective of this video, like I said, is going to be focusing on those two primary components. So we're not just looking for size, we're not just looking for strength. This is a hybrid type training where you are looking to become really, really strong and also develop really jacked legs. So let's get started. Now, it's really important to understand that strength and hypertrophy, although they are related and there is overlap, they are also distinct training adaptations. So strength is a neurological adaptation. It's driven primarily by intensity. And hypertrophy is more so driven by things like volume and primarily mechanical tension. So mechanical tension is both measured as, like a unit of 1 rep max. So how much load is actually on the bar, but then it's also measured cumulatively. And this is one of the reasons why, and we'll kind of get into this in a second, why there's such a wide range of intensities and volumes that can be used to develop muscle, whereas there's a lot more of a narrow window when it comes to developing strength, although there is still a fairly wide window. Now, when we're looking at strength, and these are, again, just kind of big picture, broad figures. Generally speaking, you're going to be focusing on repetitions between the 1 to 5 rep range. You're going to be focusing on intensities anywhere from about 70% to 100%. Now, does that mean that you can't do 60% or 65% and none of that stuff has any sort of benefit in terms of strength training? No, absolutely not. There is a time and a place for it. However, we are talking about generally what most of your training is going to look like. Most of your training is going to occur between the 70 to 100% range, and probably actually even higher, probably like the 80 to 100% range. But I digress, right? So this is going to give you a good starting point. Now, hypertrophy. This is, again, is a much, much broader rep range. We're looking at anywhere between 5 to 30 reps. You can even go as high as 50 reps sometimes. But generally speaking, you're going to be in the 5 to 30 rep range, and you're going to be anywhere between 30% 1 rep max all the way up to 80% 1 rep max. Now, most of your training in this case is going to happen between 5 and 15 reps, and it's going to be generally between 60 to 75%. That's where most and the bulk of your training is actually going to occur. However, there is a very, very good argument for incorporating intensities higher than that as well as lower than that, and doing much, much higher repetitions and sometimes doing very, very low repetitions. Like I said, within that 5 to 30 rep range and the 30 to 80% range. But generally speaking, your work is going to be about 60 to 75% for about 5 to 15 reps. Now, again, because we're trying to train for both strength and size, this is where I want to introduce a concept called concurrent training. Now, concurrent training is essentially developing various aspects at one time. So we can train for strength, endurance, speed, power, all these different things. And we can bias whatever it is that you want to prioritize in your training, which in this particular case is going to be strength and muscle. Now, the benefit of this is, again, it allows you to train for both simultaneously. So we don't need to do a hypertrophy block and then follow that up with a strength block. We can just train both at the exact same time. And in terms of benefits, in terms of what you're going to get, is one approach better than the other? I don't think there's any real good argument to suggest that concurrent is either better or worse than block periodization or linear or anything like that. It's really going to boil down to what works really well for you based on your preferences, based on your past experience, based on what you can adhere to, what you enjoy, and also based on the execution of your coach. Or if you're coaching yourself, how well are you utilizing this strategy to actually get the results you want? But concurrent training is a fantastic approach. I use it with a lot of my athletes and get very, very good results. Now, it's really important to understand that strength is a skill. And the reason why I say that is because if you increase your leg press, there's not really a reliable correlation between increasing your leg press and increasing your 1 rep max low bar squat. Okay, so we want to make sure that we also do things that have a high degree of transference into the things that you want to get really, really strong in. In this case, we're probably looking at things like the deadlift and the squat, because you're primarily trying to get your lower body and your legs really, really strong. So we want to make sure that if we want to get really strong legs and we want to get really jacked legs, that we are incorporating a combination of high specificity activities as well as lower specificity activities for some of the hypertrophy that we're looking to develop. Okay, so we need to make sure we're practicing the skill if you want to get strong, because strength is a skill. Now, this brings us to another really important point. How do we actually sequence exercise order? How do we sequence, the flow of our training? How do we sequence, day 1, day 2, day 3, and day 4? And this is really, really important. So I'm going to give you a couple recommendations here. One, we want to create an order of priority. So we want to make sure we're doing high skill, high neurological demand exercises first. Or if you have, kind of like a cyclic approach or like a DUP style approach, where you're doing your really neurologically intense stuff first, and then you're going to be doing your higher volume days a little bit later, because the neurological stuff is going to be more taxing from a skill and neurological component, whereas the volume stuff could potentially actually make your strength training days a little bit worse, just because volume tends to accumulate a little bit more fatigue. Okay, so from an exercise sequencing standpoint, as well as how you're structuring your actual training week, there is a benefit to prioritizing your high skill, high neurological demand activities first, kind of front loading it like that. So an example of this would be, let's say you have a workout, right? If you're going to do high bar barbell squats, doing that before you do leg press is probably going to be a better idea than doing leg press and then the barbell squats, because you're going to accumulate less fatigue and you're going to be able to maintain the skill component to really, really have high output in the squats to get the most out of it, since you are looking to develop strength as well. Now, this brings me to another really, really important point. If we look at let's say a training day, and let's say we only have two exercises, what is the difference between training squats and then leg extensions versus leg extensions and then squats? What is the difference? Now, if we're purely talking about hypertrophy, there probably isn't a massive difference, although I would probably tend to bias doing the squats first for a variety of reasons, but we don't necessarily need to get into that. However, if you're looking to train for muscle and strength simultaneously, like I said, it's going to be very, very important that you do your high neurological demand, high skill work first. That way you can get really high output out of that before you go into your lower skill, lower demand activities. So again, how good do you need to be? How fresh do you need to be to really push leg extensions? Not really fresh, not really anything, because it's extremely easy to do. It's very low skill activity. Whereas a barbell squat, whether it's high bar, front squat, any sort of variation like that, you do need to be fresh. You do need to have good bracing. You need to have good motor coordination. You need to be able to keep everything tight while you're executing the lift for the duration of the set or multiple sets. And so it's really important that you do your high skill work first and then do your lower skill externally stabilized movements afterwards. Okay. Now, a couple really important considerations when we're looking at the stimulus to fatigue ratio. Okay, so the higher intensity you go, the more fatigue that generates. The more volume you do, the more fatigue that generates. Okay, so we can't just hit like a 1 rep max and then do a bunch of other stuff after that, because it's just going to accumulate way too much fatigue. So how can we train for higher intensities and then still get enough volume in to push both strength and muscle at the same time? This is a really important consideration. We are going to touch on that a little bit in the later sections of this video, but that is something to really consider. Exercise selection is really important. If we look at the difference between, let's say, a low bar squat and a high bar squat, low bar squats generally allow you to lift more weight just because the weight is closer to center mass, the loading distribution, all of that stuff is a little bit different. So if we can tolerate more load, that means we're going to accrue more fatigue, because the absolute load on the bar on a low bar squat is going to be higher than the absolute load on a high bar squat. If we compare that to a front squat, again, we have differences in loading, which means differences in fatigue accumulated. If we look at the difference between a Smith machine squat, that's not internally stabilized. So now we remove one component and make it even easier. So we compare that to a low bar squat, and now again, we're making things a little bit easier. If we compare that to a leg press, now we don't even have any axial loading, or we have very minimal axial loading. Okay, so if we look at these different exercises, it's really important to understand the fatigue that's going to be associated when we push those exercises really, really hard, which you'll need to do if you're trying to build muscle and strength. So it's important to understand those differences there. We look at the neurological demand as well. So if we're doing things really, really explosively or really quickly, like we're doing deadlifts, really explosive, we're just trying to blow the bar off the ground. If you're doing plyometrics, probably not very beneficial for hypertrophy, and limited use for strength, although there is some benefit, but I'd probably argue that doing some speed work would be a little bit better than that because it's a little bit more specific. However, I digress. All of these things are going to play a role. Again, if we look at external versus internal stabilization, a barbell squat, you're having to stabilize on your own. You don't have anything stabilizing you. A Smith machine squat is externally stabilized. So you don't need to stabilize. All you need to do is just push the weight up, basically. And you do need to brace a little bit, but the demands of internal stability are going to be reduced fairly significantly. Then we change that to a hack squat, and now the internal stabilization requirements go down even more. So these are all things that are going to generate fatigue. And these are differences that are really important to understand when you're selecting the exercises and when you're actually creating that exercise sequence. It's really important to understand how those things are going to carry over from a fatigue standpoint, from a stimulus standpoint, not just in the training session, but in subsequent sessions throughout the week and then the following week and so on. Now, as you can kind of see with, the rep ranges, the intensity ranges and all that stuff, hypertrophy has a lot less constraints than strength training does, especially from a specificity standpoint, because it doesn't really matter what it is that you're doing. You just need to train the muscle, and you can train the muscle from a variety of different ways, whereas strength is very, very specific. As I said earlier, doing a leg press doesn't guarantee your squat's going to go up, even though you're training your legs, right? So, strength is force vector, it's load, it's specific to all these different things, including joint angle and all that jazz. So we really, really need to make sure that, when you are training for strength, you're staying a little bit more specific. And when you're trying to hit the hypertrophy side of things, now we have a lot more room for variation. And that's one of the reasons why there is a little bit of overlap between hypertrophy and strength, is because, even though we're lifting heavy and specific, that's still going to stimulate muscle growth because of the mechanical tension aspect. All right. Now, here are some practical recommendations that are important to know. Okay, technique should be the #1 priority, regardless of whether you are training for strength or hypertrophy, and here's the reason why. If we are training for strength, then, like I said, the #1 thing that we need to prioritize is neurological adaptation. We need to prioritize load on the bar. We need to make sure we're getting the most stimulus that we can that's going to be most productive for that day. So if you're moving inefficiently, if you're not lifting with good technique and you have really shitty movement economy, guess what that's going to do? That's going to put a constraint on your ability to tolerate heavier loads and do more volume. If we can't squat as heavy, that's going to limit the amount of strength we can develop because we have a very clear bottleneck that resides in technique. Okay, so we need to make sure that our technique is really, really solid in order to optimize our strength. Now, from a hypertrophy standpoint, technique is also incredibly important because if you're doing bicep curls and you're, heaving and stuff like that, well, now we're offloading mechanical tension from the biceps onto the low back, the shoulders, and we're just using momentum. So we're not putting the tension into the muscles that are desired. We're trying to grow that area. So we want to make sure we're using strict form, you're using really good technique, and technique has to be the #1 priority when you are training. Should there be a little bit of technical degradation when you're approaching failure? Yes, that's going to happen, but it's nowhere near what people will allow in their training. It's a little bit. You don't need to have significant technical degradation. There should be very, very minimal technical breakdown when you're lifting, whether it's approaching, max lifts in terms of 1RM, or you're approaching failure in your lifts for hypertrophy. It shouldn't happen to a significant degree, and you should still be executing with very, very good technique, regardless of where you are to failure or how much is in the bar, okay? That's a really important thing to keep in mind. Now, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of exercise selection and sequence, you want to think about training your main lifts first when you're fresh, because that's when you're going to have the highest output. So if you're doing a barbell squat first, well, that's going to require the most out of you from a neurological standpoint, from a skill standpoint, from a motor coordination standpoint, and so on. We want to make sure we're fresh for that and we can put the most amount of energy into that so we have the highest output. Then we can kind of regress the activities beyond that. And that's going to allow us to benefit from optimizing the neurological stimulus while still getting a high degree of tension on the desired muscles when we're squatting. Now, it's also important to understand that you can use regressions in your secondary and tertiary lifts that are less fatiguing, maybe even externally stabilized versus internally stabilized, to still get really, really high output, but now we're shifting the focus from a neurological stimulus to more of a mechanical tension stimulus to really elicit a lot of muscle growth. Okay, you don't have to necessarily, but it is potentially a good idea. Now, you can use a combination of internally and externally stabilized movements for your accessories. Some examples of this might be Bulgarian split squats. So they're fantastic for building your quads and your glutes, depending on how you do them. And also leg curls, right? Leg curls, very, very simple machine, but it's excellent at targeting your hamstrings. So these are differences between internally and externally stabilized. So obviously the Bulgarian split squat, you're going to have to internally stabilize because you have to balance yourself. Whereas the leg curl, it's a fixed machine, it's a fixed range of motion. You don't really have to do anything. All you have to do is just contract your muscle, and the pad's going to move up and down. Now, here's one really important factor to keep in mind. Unless you're already massive, don't sweat the small stuff. I see a lot of really advanced bodybuilders doing these really interesting techniques, and all of that is fantastic, and they probably need it because they're super advanced. But unless you're already massive, you just don't need to worry about it. Your number one priority isn't building a little bit more muscle in your posterior delts. It's that your delts are just too small in general, your legs, everything is just too small. You just need to build muscle everywhere. So unless you're really, really advanced, don't worry about a lot of the minutia. Don't worry about, how this guy does it or that guy does it. Just focus on getting big in general. And then once you're really big and once you're really lean, that's when you can start worrying about, okay, well, I think I need a little bit more on my upper chest. I think I need a little bit more on my triceps and so on and so forth. But until you're at that level, just don't even worry about it because it's just going to be a waste of time, to be honest. So as promised, I think it's really important to understand how to actually apply these things. So I wanted to give you guys an actual look at, 2 different leg training days to give you an actual example and a breakdown of why I might structure, a workout like this. So here's the first example. We're going to start out with some high bar barbell squats. So we're going to do a set of 5 at 2 reps in reserve, and then we're going to do 3 sets of 5 pause at 90% of the top set. So we're still getting a pretty good stimulus for strength. We're hitting within that 1 to 5 rep range. We're hitting a reasonably high intensity. Even though we're using RIR instead of percentages, we're still hitting a reasonably high intensity. Now you could do 1 by 5, 1 by 3, 1 by 2, it doesn't really matter. You could even do a heavy single at like a 2 to 3 RIR. Perfectly fine. The point is that we're using a specific exercise like the barbell squat, and we are doing something reasonably heavy and accumulating a little bit of volume. So you can see that we have 4 total sets. Now 4 sets is just kind of arbitrary. You could do 1, you could do 2, you could do 3, you could do 6. Doesn't necessarily matter. It's just to give you a general idea of how the whole day is structured and why I structured it that way. So I wanted to get a little bit of work on the specific movement of the squat to really build up the skill, to get the neurological stimulus. So we have the high output activity first, high neurological demand exercise first. Then we look to the second exercise. Well, this is a really big regression. We're moving from a high bar squat that's internally stabilized, high motor skill, all that stuff, into an externally stabilized that's basically going to allow us very high output on the muscles, which is different. So now we're doing 1 set of 12 to 15. So again, we're using a much higher rep range. We're still going pretty heavy, somewhere within the 2 RIR range. Now, the reason why most of these activities are going to be 1 RIR, 2 RIR, 3 RIR is because when we look at the literature on strength and hypertrophy, most of your strength and hypertrophy is going to occur within 1 to 3 reps of failure. Okay. Now there's something to be said for going a little bit higher, a little bit lower, and things like that. However, these are good general guidelines and are going to work in most instances. Okay. So you can tweak them on your own, but these are going to get you in the ballpark pretty damn close to what's going to work pretty effectively for most people. So we're doing the leg press. We're accruing a decent amount of volume. Now, because we've already done, a bunch of squatting, we've already done 4, decently heavy sets. We're only going to do 1 set of leg press. Now, you could do 2, you could do 3, doesn't necessarily matter. I just chose to do 1 set in this case because this would be a workout that I might prescribe for myself, okay? Then we're gonna move on to the RDLs. Now we're gonna be targeting the hamstrings specifically, and we're gonna target the hamstrings from the insertion standpoint. So you can see that we're doing RDLs, but we're also doing Nordic curls. So we're targeting the hamstrings in slightly different ways depending on how you're looking at this, okay? So we're doing RDLs. We're doing 2 sets of 8 to 10 at 2 RIR. Again, because we're training for strength, you still want to be loading your hips. You want to be loading your back musculature. You want to be loading all that stuff because we do want to get really, really strong. And RDLs are a fantastic way to train your posterior chain. They're also going to hammer your back, your glutes, your hamstrings. So really, really good activity in my opinion. Then we're going to superset. So you can see the A1, A2, that basically just denotes we're doing a superset. So we're going to superset Bulgarian split squats with Nordic curls. Now, I'm a big fan of Nordic curls. I find that they are really good for injury prevention, just helping people's knees feel really good, whether they're powerlifters or bodybuilders. So I really like that activity to put it in there, in addition to also, prone leg curls, seated leg curls, all that stuff. But I just really like these, so that's why I put them in there. But you can sub whatever you want, okay? Dumbbell Bulgarian split squats, I really like these because it's not quite a unilateral exercise, but it's a split stance exercise, which is going to increase your stability requirements. And it's going to be a very good activity to balance out any sort of bilateral discrepancies. Now, I generally like making sure that the rehab is also present in the training. So when I'm using Bulgarian split squats, Nordic curls, things like that, those are not only to enhance muscle size and muscle strength, but they're also there to be somewhat protective in terms of injury risk reduction. Now, I'm a very big believer of that. The guy who trains the longest, that's the one who's going to be the strongest and the biggest. So you want to make sure we're keeping yourself healthy, or if you're coaching athletes, keeping your athletes healthy. So again, Nordic curls, really, really good for preventing hamstring strains and things like that. Dumbbell Bulgarian split squats or lunges or any sort of, split stance work, I think is very important if you're always doing bilateral movements like squats, leg press, all that stuff. I think you should be able to balance on one leg fairly effectively, and you can see differences in mobility, differences in strength from one side to the other. And this is going to help minimize that and make sure that it doesn't go too far to the point where you might actually increase the risk of injury. Okay, then we just have some standing calf press, 2 sets to failure, not a big deal, pretty straightforward. All right, now let's look at day 2. Okay, day 2 is going to be a little bit different. So we have high bar squats. Again, I kept it 1 set of 5 at 2 RR just to keep things pretty simple, but you could go top single at 2 to 3 RR and then just do the rest of your work or whatever it is you like, okay? But again, we're doing our high neurologically demanding work first, and then we're regressing it down. So then after that, we're going to go Smith machine squat, 3 sets of 10 to 15 at 2 RIR. Now, the reason why I said 10 to 15 is because if you're doing 3 sets of 10 to 15, you're actually doing a true 2 RIR. You might do your first set of 15, but then you're probably going to, experience an increase in fatigue as the sets go on. So you might not be able to maintain that output. In fact, it would almost be impossible to maintain that output if you're actually training to the prescribed intensities. So you might get 15 your first set, then maybe your next set you're only getting like 13, then 12, then 10. And so as the set goes on, you're going to hit less and less and less reps because fatigue is accumulated, right? Which is why I give a little bit more of a rep range. Then we're going to do some 2-inch deficit stiff leg deadlifts, 2 sets of 10 to 12 at 2 reps in reserve. Again, you want to be pretty heavy, really hitting the posterior chain, just getting really, really strong. Now, the 2-inch deficit deadlifts are fantastic because this is putting you in a very, very stretched position. So the RDLs are a little bit different. We are training your hamstrings. We're also really, really hitting those glutes as well because we're kind of biasing that top end range. Whereas this one, we're actually increasing the range. So we're increasing the stretch, increasing mechanical tension in the hamstrings and really, really loading the hamstrings up a ton. This is a great exercise for building up posterior chain, specifically hamstrings. Then we're doing another superset. So we're doing leg extensions, 2 sets of failure, and then prone leg curls, 2 sets of failure. Aim to fail around 15 reps. Okay, so whether you get 17 or 15 or 13 or whatever, not a huge deal. We're just going to try and select a load where you can fail roughly at around 15 reps, give or take, 3 or 4, something like that. Okay. And again, because these are externally stabilized movements, you can push them super fucking hard and they are going to trash you, but they're not necessarily going to be as fatiguing as if you were to go to failure on like a Smith machine squat or a leg press or high bar squat. Those exercises will fuck you up neurologically. So these are going to be a little bit more effective to push to failure because they're not going to accumulate as much fatigue, but they're still going to be super freaking targeted and super stimulative for muscle growth. Then we're doing the adductor machine, 2 sets of 20 at 1 to 2 RIR. Again, I really think it's important to look at longevity. So when we're training, we're not just training the quads and the hamstrings, you're training your adductors, you're training your ability to abduct as well. So maybe you're going to do some abduction on the machine as well on another training session. Maybe you're going to do some goblet Cossack squats. You're going to do things that are going to help improve your longevity and resiliency. Now, we don't have tons and tons of that stuff in here, but again, these are just 2 sample exercise or 2 sample workouts. But that's still something that's an additional consideration I think is incredibly important. Looking at athlete longevity, looking at what's going to keep them healthy for a long period of time so we can increase output, but more than that, we can prevent them from getting injured or at least reduce the risk of getting injured unnecessarily. So that's all I have for today, guys. I hope that helps, and I hope that really, really gives you guys some specific and practical takeaways that you can use to implement in your own training to get jacked and fucking strong legs, because let's be honest, 99% of chicks love dudes that are strong and jacked in the lower body. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.